Usually when we think about being trapped, there's this expectation of a physical reality to it, like a literal cage.
Right, yeah, you expect to see the iron bars.
Exactly. You see the bars, you feel the heavy lock, the guard points at you and says, you can't leave.
It's an undeniable physical boundary.
Hmm.
And, I mean, in a strange way, that physical boundary is almost comforting.
Comfort. Wait, how so?
Well, because there's absolutely no ambiguity about what is keeping you stuck. You know exactly where the limit is.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But then you step into the world of modern human behavior, into the way we actually live and work and socialize today, and suddenly those iron bars are completely invisible.
They're entirely in our heads.
Right. We end up navigating a prison landscape that we essentially built in our own minds. And that is exactly what Joseph Sack explores in his striking manifesto, Internal Authority josephsack.pdf, a field guide for the self-governed.
It's an incredible piece of writing.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to look at Sack's argument for how modern society has quietly conditioned us to outsource our judgment. And more importantly, we're going to explore how you, yes, you listening to this right now, can reclaim what he calls the pilot seat of your own life by building internal authority.
Which is something I think we all struggle with, whether we realize it or not.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it for a second. Have you ever found yourself asking for permission to make a move in your career, or maybe in your personal life, only to realize later that literally no one was stopping you?
You're just waiting for a green light.
Yeah, waiting for a green light at an intersection that didn't even have a traffic signal.
Hmm.
We're going to uncover exactly where Sack believes that instinct comes from.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
How does the author argue that this invisible cage of modern compliance was actually built?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to recognize that Sack isn't presenting some grand conspiracy theory here. Nobody is sitting in a smoke-filled room twisting their mustache.
Right, it's not a James Bond villain situation. Exactly. What he outlines is a centuries-long historical shift. We transition from a state of general human autonomy to a state of profound institutional dependency. To understand why you might feel an inherent need to ask for permission today, the manifesto suggests you really have to trace the historical roots of our daily routines.
Like going all the way back to before the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, before industrial factories existed, most people didn't have jobs in the way we understand that word today. They had lives that were just woven into the work they did to survive, usually farming common shared land.
So their rhythm was dictated by like the sun and the weather and the seasons rather than a middle manager or a factory whistle.
Precisely. They owned their time, even if the labor itself was incredibly grueling. That task-oriented time was entirely natural to human history. You work intensely when the harvest needs to be brought in, and then,
You rest when the work is done.
right, you rest. But then came the enclosure movements over the centuries across Europe. Common lands were systematically fenced off into private hands. Millions of people were suddenly cut off from their independent food sources.
Which leaves them with what? Starvation?
Starvation is a remarkably effective recruiter. Sack makes this chilling point that the system first created a massive dependency by taking away the land, and then conveniently offered factory labor as the only remedy for survival.
Man, that's intense. This is a pretty controversial premise, this idea that the modern workplace was born entirely out of forced desperation rather than, innovation.
It is, but Sack goes further. He points out that once these people got into the early factories, the owners had a massive problem. The people didn't know how to act like workers.
Because they were used to their own rhythms.
Exactly. A person raised on the rhythm of their own land rests when their body is tired. They don't understand why a mechanical clock owned by a stranger should dictate their biology. Factory owners in the 18th and 19th centuries were constantly complaining that these early workers lacked discipline.
But what they really meant was they just still acted like free, autonomous people.
Right, they would just take a Tuesday off because they felt like it. So industrial discipline had to be manufactured from scratch. It was built through strict fines, physical punishments, and the constant looming threat of poverty.
Wow.
Sack argues that over generations, society successfully installed the idea that obeying the clock was a moral virtue, and that feeling tired or resting was something to actually feel guilty about.
Guilt as an installed mechanism for productivity? That is heavy. And Sack argues that this necessity for factory discipline leads directly to how we train children, right?
Yeah, because you can't easily force a grown adult who remembers the open fields to suddenly live by a bell. So the institution started younger. They connected the factory floor directly to the classroom.
making schools a training ground.
Schools were literally modeled on industrial necessity. You take a child whose natural biological state is constant movement, play, curiosity, and you require them to sit completely still in straight rows for 8 hours a day.
A bell rings, they move to the next station.
Another bell rings, they stop, even if they were in the middle of a brilliant thought. They literally have to raise their hand and ask a state authority figure for permission to use the bathroom.
Yeah, asking for permission for a basic bodily function.
Sack puts this incredibly bluntly in the text. I'll quote it directly. "We did not design the schooling system to liberate the mind. We designed it to produce a person who could tolerate a factory."
To produce a person who could tolerate a factory. That is just an intense way of looking at it. It's like we've been playing a massive multi-generational game of Simon Says, and we've been so intensely focused on following the rules of the game for hundreds of years that we forgot Simon isn't actually a real entity.
That's a great way to frame it. Sack uses the analogy of the wolf and the dog to illustrate exactly that internalization. You cannot tame a wild animal that has known the open ground because it fundamentally remembers what freedom feels like.
But a dog is different.
Right. If you take a puppy and raise it entirely inside a small fenced yard, it grows up believing that fence is the literal edge of the universe. It doesn't pace the perimeter dreaming of escape. It guards the yard. It barks at anything outside of it.
So the limits feel like loyalty, not confinement.
Yes. This historical conditioning created the ultimate efficiency for institutions. As the manifesto states, and this is a key takeaway, the most efficient control is the kind a person enforces on themselves because it costs the system nothing and the person mistakes it for character.
Wow. Mistakes it for character. That brings up a fascinating psychological transition. The author is suggesting that because we are conditioned from such a young age, we don't just endure this invisible cage, we actually adopt it as our identity. We mistake our conditioning for our character, which Sack calls the prepackaged self.
The conditioning becomes entirely indistinguishable from the person's soul. We often praise stability in childhood, but Sack argues that this stability is frequently a Trojan horse that smuggles in conformity.
How so?
Well, a child is handed a set of values, corporate ambitions, and a highly specific definition of a good life, almost like a school uniform. But because it happens before their critical thinking fully develops, the person wears the uniform so naturally they genuinely believe they picked it out themselves.
I think to you, the listener, if you look at your own life, you can probably see the real weight of this when we talk about how this conformity is enforced. The manifesto points out that the cage isn't primarily maintained top-down by some monolithic government or evil corporation. It's enforced sideways.
Sideways, yes. Horizontal enforcement is far more powerful than top-down mandates. It comes from your neighbors, your coworkers, the casual comments your family makes around the dinner table.
Just everyday interactions.
Exactly. Sack writes, "The conditioned do not merely live inside the system, they become missionaries for it, sincerely, without ever being asked." People transmit these prepackaged assumptions through simple imitation, constantly policing each other to stay in line with societal norms.
But wait, pushing back on the author's premise for a moment here, isn't some level of conformity strictly necessary just to have a functioning society? I mean, if everyone just did whatever they wanted, ignored all credentials, and acted entirely on their own judgment, wouldn't that just be total societal chaos?
What's fascinating here is that Sack isn't advocating for anarchy or rebellion just for the sake of being a contrarian. Building internal authority isn't about burning everything down.
Okay, then what is it?
It is simply the refusal to blindly outsource your judgment to an institution. When someone actually exercises that internal authority, say, by leaving a prestigious law firm to open a tiny bakery, or building a career without the proper degree, the anger they provoke from their peers isn't about maintaining social order. It's a defense mechanism.
Ah, I see. If someone sees you stepping out of line, your freedom becomes a direct threat to their sense of self.
Precisely because your existence implies that the cage was optional all along. If you can survive and be happy outside the conventional structure, it means that the sacrifices the compliant person made, sacrificing their own autonomy, their own dreams, might have been completely unnecessary.
And that is a deeply terrifying realization.
So to protect themselves from that existential dread, society has to pathologize independence. Self-trust gets socially relabeled as recklessness. Independence is dismissed as arrogance.
So they have to make the free person look broken or foolish so their own compliance continues to look like wisdom.
Exactly. Sack profoundly notes, your freedom is not the wound. The wound is what your freedom reveals about their compliance.
The wound is what your freedom reveals about their compliance. That shifts the entire perspective on social rejection. If someone is intensely attacking you for stepping off the standard path, they aren't actually evaluating your choices. They're just aggressively defending the sacrifices they made to stay on theirs.
All projection.
But let's be honest, confronting that reality, confronting the possibility that we might be living in a cage of our own making is incredibly painful. So according to the manifesto, we find ways to avoid looking at it.
Because the naked truth of our own outsourced agency is unbearable, people exhaust their energy on literally anything else. This is where SAC introduces the concept of mass societal distraction.
Right, like what kind of distractions?
People pour their entire identities into partisan politics, professional sports, the daily outrage cycle on social media. It serves as a necessary pressure valve. If you are constantly exhausted by surface-level cultural conflicts, you have absolutely zero energy left to question the deep structural machinery that actually dictates your daily life.
Here's where it gets really interesting. SAC specifically applies this framework to the modern panic around artificial intelligence, which is a brilliant modern test case for his theory.
It really is.
Everywhere you look, people are sounding the alarm that AI is going to dehumanize us, that algorithms are going to strip away our human agency.
But AI is just the perfect safe target for our anxiety. People point at large language models as the great threat to humanity. But SAC points out that the actual dehumanizing machine, the institutional system that actively strips away human autonomy and trains adults to wait for approval, like children started centuries before the first microchip was ever invented.
So true.
By screaming about the threat of AI, we get to pretend that human autonomy is something we currently possess and need to protect, rather than something we surrendered during the Industrial Revolution.
It's like blaming the rain for a leaky roof when we're the ones who built the house without shingles. We're pointing at the newest software update, but the real bug is in our own operating system. We're distracting ourselves from the real problem.
And that real problem is what SAC identifies as the inner lock. When people lose their internal authority, they don't just become passive subjects, they become active enforcers.
Like the horizontal enforcement we talked about.
Yes, they desperately try to control the outside world because they feel so fundamentally out of control internally. Think about the chronic micromanagers in your office, or the people who aggressively police the minor behaviors of strangers in public.
Oh yeah, we all know a few of those.
Right. That intense need to control others is actually a subconscious confession of their complete inability to govern themselves.
There's a real psychological terror at play there. If they start managing everyone else's business, they have to sit quietly in a room with themselves.
They are terrified to realize that there is no active pilot in their own cockpit. They might discover that their deepest beliefs, their political stances, and their emotional reactions were entirely installed by external forces.
That's a scary thought.
It is. SAC notes, at least the technology is honest about what it is. The institutions wrap the cage in the language of your protection and your growth, and then removed your agency while you thank them.
Removed your agency while you thanked them. Brutal.
He follows that by observing, the fiercest defenders of the cage are the people most terrified of the emptiness they would have to face if the cage were gone.
Okay, so if the lock is internal, the key to getting out must be internal too. We've spent a lot of time diagnosing the architecture of this invisible cage. Let's transition to the really uncomfortable, practical work of stepping out of it. SAC argues the key is self-awareness, but he is very specific that he doesn't mean the modern, popular version of self-awareness.
No, not at all.
He's not talking about journaling your feelings or posting a long, performative essay on social media about your self-care routine.
Performative self-awareness is just another product of the cage. Real self-awareness, in SAC's framework, is a brutal, unglamorous reckoning. It is the hard work of tracing your core beliefs, your career choices, and your habits back to their absolute roots and asking one highly uncomfortable question. Did I actually decide this, or was I trained into it?
And I imagine that really feels good.
It doesn't. In fact, it often feels like a profound loss because you are actively dismantling the false, prepackaged self you've relied on for years. SAC warns that, quote, most people would rather argue about anything in the world than sit in a quiet room and ask whether the self they are defending was ever actually theirs.
Practically speaking, the text suggests this transformation comes down to the difference between a reaction and a choice. It's about cultivating a pause in your daily life.
Yes. The conditioned self operates purely on reaction. A stimulus occurs, maybe an email from a boss or a comment from a family member, and an automatic emotional or behavioral response fires off immediately.
Like reflex.
Exactly. You might think that reaction is your free will, but it's really just your installed programming executing on schedule. Building internal authority is about deliberately widening the gap between a stimuli and your response. In that momentary pause, you suspend the programming, and genuine autonomous choice becomes possible.
That's the moment you actually step into the role of the pilot. You stop asking for permission when permission isn't technically required. But the author makes it clear that stepping into that open field of autonomy is incredibly heavy.
It is.
Because inside the cage, you could always blame the middle manager, the corporate policy, or the rigid institution for your unhappiness. In the open field, there's absolutely nothing to hide behind. It is pure accountability.
The weight of full responsibility is exactly why so many people retreat back to the cage. But I think it's vital to clarify Sachs' analogy of the pilot here so listeners don't misinterpret his point. Having internal authority doesn't mean you isolate yourself in a cabin in the woods and stubbornly refuse all outside advice.
Right, it's not about being a hermit.
Not at all. Think of an actual airline pilot. A pilot constantly listens to air traffic control. They read their complex instrument panels. They review weather maps provided by meteorologists. They take in massive amounts of external data and expertise.
But the pilot evaluates all of that data and makes the final decision on how to fly the plane. They don't let air traffic control blindly fly it for them.
Precisely. As Sachs puts it, internal authority is not the absence of input from others. It is the presence of a self that decides what to do with that input.
So, reading through this, Sachs brings up this strategy of conscious compliance for how we handle the rest of society, which at first glance almost sounds like a paradox. So what does this all mean? How do we actually live like this day to day without getting into a fight with everyone we meet?
This raises an important question about how an internally governed person actually interacts with a highly compliant world. Sachs strongly warns against becoming what he calls a missionary in reverse.
A missionary in reverse.
Yeah, meaning you cannot forcefully shake your coworkers awake. If you spend your life angrily rebelling against every minor societal rule just to prove how independent you are, the system is still entirely controlling your behavior. You're just letting it control you in opposition.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Conscious compliance is about reclaiming your agency within the structure.
So you don't have to break a rule just to prove you are free. You might choose to wear the suit, go to the corporate meeting, follow the arbitrary rules of your industry, but you do it from a place of active, strategic choice, not blind, terrified reaction.
You weigh the rule, and you decide that following it makes sense for your personal heading at this specific moment. On the outside, to a casual observer, you might look exactly like someone who is just blindly conforming to the system.
But internally.
Internally, the experience is completely different.
Hmm.
You are a pilot who has retained the explicit knowledge that you could choose otherwise at any moment.
You're in on the game. You're still playing Simon Says, but you know Simon is an illusion, and you're simply choosing to play the game because it serves your current goals.
Exactly. You recognize that you cannot decondition the entire world. You cannot tear down a centuries-old global structure of institutional compliance by tomorrow morning. But you have absolute power over the inner lock. You can decline the prepackaged self.
And that really brings together the core journey of this manifesto. We aren't going to fix the world's obsession with credentials, institutional permission slips, and lateral social enforcement, but we can build a personal life that undeniably runs on internal authority. And by doing that, we find peace in it.
It's the only way.
Sachs argues that this peace is the ultimate proof of the concept. He writes, "The most persuasive argument for living freely is a person who is visibly, undeniably living freely and is at peace." You don't have to argue the philosophy with anyone. You just have to embody it.
It becomes quiet, undeniable evidence to the people around you that an alternative way of living actually exists. And once you've built that internal architecture, no institution and no sideways pressure from your peers can ever take it from you.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day, building on everything we've explored in Sachs' work. Take a look at your calendar for next week, or look at the major life goals you've set for yourself this year. If you trace those commitments back to their absolute origin, how many of those goals were actually chosen by the pilot inside of you? And how many are just the prepackaged self, executing a centuries-old program, waiting for a permission slip from someone else? Remember, the iron bars aren't real. The door has been unlocked this whole time. Will you reach for the handle?